That Christmas night, a single sentence from my son saved my life. "Mom, taste this dish," he said. My daughter-in-law smiled, and her eyes held a glint I had never seen before. So I quietly switched our plates. A man died right there at the table, and everyone called it a sudden heart attack. Only I knew that dinner was actually a murder plan, prepared down to the very last spoonful of sauce. My name is Eleanor Graves. I am 68 years old, a widow living in the Park Hill neighborhood just outside of Denver. To the rest of the world, I am simply the quiet woman in the brick bungalow who tends to her hydrangeas and pays her bills on time. But as I sit here in the silence of my empty house, I know the truth that would make my neighbors shudder behind their locked doors. My only son, Michael, is dead because of a choice I made in the span of a heartbeat on Christmas Eve. It was snowing heavily that night, thick, wet flakes piled up against the drafty window panes, sealing us inside. I had tried so hard to make the house feel warm. I had polished the silverware that we only used once a year and arranged the chipped porcelain nativity set on the mantel just so. I wanted to keep the family together, to pretend the cracks in the foundation were not widening. Michael arrived first. He was 43, a technical lead at Northwind Data Systems, and he looked healthier than I had seen him in years. His cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and his laugh filled my small kitchen, chasing away the shadows. Then came Savannah. My daughter-in-law was 36, a woman who worked for an agency called Silver Peak Social, though to my old eyes, her job seemed to consist entirely of photographing her own reflection. She called herself a digital creator. I called her Trouble. That night, the atmosphere shifted the moment she walked in. She was manic, buzzing with an energy that felt jagged. She had insisted on preparing the main course herself. This was a woman who usually ordered takeout because boiling water was too much effort. Yet there she was, presenting a casserole she called her signature dish. She set up a ring light on my dining table, pushing aside my centerpiece. She needed to capture my authentic reaction to her cooking. She said, it was for her followers. We sat down, and the air felt tight, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. Michael was oblivious. Bless his heart. He reached over with the serving spoon, scooped a large portion of Savannah's steaming casserole, and dropped it onto my floral plate. He smiled at me, that boyish grin I had loved since he was a baby. "Mom, taste this dish," he said. Savannah worked so hard on it. I looked up. Savannah was standing across from me, her phone held high, recording. Her smile was wide, plastered on, but her eyes were dead serious. They held a glint of anticipation that made my stomach turn. I looked down at the food. The steam rose up, carrying a scent that did not belong in a holiday meal. It was faint, buried under heavy spices, but it was there. A metallic tang, copper and wrongness. I have cooked for 50 years. I know what garlic and onion and sage smell like. This was chemistry, not culinary art. A memory flashed in my mind of a joke Savannah made in July about how much Michael's life insurance policy was worth. I did not panic. I became a clumsy old woman. I stood up, feigning a shiver. "Michael, you are sitting in a draft," I said. "Come switch seats with me. Go sit by the fire where it is warm." I picked up my plate and moved it to his spot before he could protest. I took his empty plate. It happened in seconds. Savannah was too busy checking her frame on the screen to notice the plates had swapped ownership along with the seats. Michael shrugged and sat down in front of the poisoned serving. He took a bite. He chewed. He swallowed. I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. We talked about the snow. Then, mid-sentence, his eyes went wide. He grabbed his chest. The fork clattered onto the china. He fell forward, taking the tablecloth and the wine glasses with him. The Christmas tree shook as his body hit the floor, before the first ornament shattered, before I could even check for a pulse. Savannah was already screaming. Heart attack. She shrieked. It was a heart attack. She yelled the diagnosis before the 911 operator even answered the line. I fell to my knees beside him. The house was screaming, but the silence inside me was louder. I wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. A smear of that sauce stained the white fabric. I looked at it, red and glistening in the light of the fire. That bite should have been mine. We buried Michael on a Tuesday when the ground was frozen hard as iron. The wind at the cemetery was merciless, whipping across the open graves and cutting through the layers of my heavy wool coat. Every time the shovel turned and dirt hit the casket with a hollow thud, I felt my own heart stop for a beat. Behind me, I heard the hushed whispers of neighbors and distant relatives. They murmured about how tragic it was for a man in his early 40s to drop dead from heart failure. They shook their heads and said stress was a silent killer. I stood silent and stone-faced, listening to their lies while I watched Savannah. My daughter-in-law played the role of the grieving widow with terrifying precision. Her black dress was modest, high-necked and hemmed below the knee. Her tears fell exactly when the pastor mentioned Michael's kindness. To anyone else, she was a portrait of devastation. But I have watched her for years, and I saw what the others missed. Between her sobs, her hand kept diving into her purse. She was not clutching a tissue. She was checking her phone, her eyes darting to the screen every 30 seconds. She was not mourning. She was waiting for a confirmation email. The wake at the house was a quiet affair. By 5 in the evening, the last of the guests had mumbled their condolences and driven away, leaving the house submerged in a suffocating silence. I was exhausted down to my bones. I wanted nothing more than to retreat to my bedroom, lock the door, and let the grief finally break me. But before I could turn the handle, the atmosphere in the living room shifted. Savannah kicked off her black heels. She walked to the sidebar and poured herself a glass of red wine, filling it to the brim. She took a long, greedy gulp and let out a sigh of relief. "The show is over." "Eleanor," she said, her voice stripped of all its trembling softness. "You can stop the weeping mother act now. It is depressing." She reached into a cabinet I never used and pulled out a manila folder. She tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a slap that echoed in the empty room. "Read it," she said. I sat down, my hands trembling as I reached for my reading glasses. Inside was a document titled Quitclaim Deed. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was clear. The paper claimed that Michael had signed over the entire deed of this house to Savannah 3 weeks before he died. The reason listed was collateral for an investment loan. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page. There was Michael's name, scrawled in blue ink. But it was wrong. I stared at the loops of the letters. Michael always wrote his capital M with a sharp peak, and his G had a distinct, lazy tail. This signature was too round, too hesitant. It looked nothing like the handwriting on the Christmas cards he had written to me every year of his life. My intuition screamed that this was a forgery, just as the meal had been a weapon. but I kept my face blank. I looked up at her with feigned confusion, pretending the words were too complex for my old brain to process. "This house is mine now," Savannah said, taking another sip of wine. "Legally and officially. I am putting it on the market as soon as the probate clears. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. If you are not out by then, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." She looked at me with pure contempt. "Do not look so shocked," she sneered. "I do not want an old woman living on my floorboards while I try to sell the place." I looked around the living room. My husband and I had built this house when we had nothing but lint in our pockets. Every brick outside, every beam in the ceiling, was paid for with sweat and sacrifice. I looked back at the forged paper, and then at the woman drinking wine in my husband's chair. I remembered the metallic smell of the sauce from Christmas Eve. I realized then that if I had not switched the plates, she would be having this conversation with a different old woman, or perhaps just speaking to an empty room. A strange calm settled over me. It was cold and hard, like the frozen earth covering my son. I stood up and smoothed the front of my dress. I did not scream. I did not beg. I offered her a very small, very faint smile. "I do not need 30 days," I said softly. "I am leaving tonight." I turned my back on her stunned expression and walked into my bedroom. I pulled my old travel bag from the closet. I packed 2 changes of clothes, my toothbrush, and the heavy leather-bound notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. I did not look back. I drove my old sedan down the interstate until I found a motel with a vacancy sign flickering in the dark. It was a cheap place near the highway exit, the kind where truckers stopped for a few hours of sleep. The room smelled of stale tobacco and industrial cleaner, and the sheets were rough against my skin. But for the first time in weeks, I closed my eyes without fearing the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I felt safe here. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the thick leather notebook I had taken from under my mattress. To anyone else, it might have looked like a diary or a collection of old recipes. But it was neither. It was a ledger. On the first page, dated 30 years ago, was the address of a dilapidated duplex in the working-class district. Next to it was the purchase price, a sum that seems laughably small today, and a list of repairs my husband and I had done with our own hands. People in Park Hill saw Eleanor Graves as a simple housewife who got lucky with a nice husband. They did not know that before we moved to the suburbs. Robert and I were a construction team. We bought broken things and made them whole. Over 3 decades, we acquired row houses, small apartments, and commercial lots across Denver. We did not sell them. We rented them out. We lived frugally, reinvesting every penny into a legal entity we created to keep our names off the public records. We called it the Graves Community Trust. I ran my hand over the paper. I remembered Robert lying in his hospital bed, his breathing shallow. He had grabbed my hand with surprising strength and made me promise to finalize the trust documents. He told me to protect what we built from people who only saw the money and not the sweat. Michael had been sitting in the corner of the hospital room that day. He had nodded solemnly as he signed the paperwork as a witness. He knew everything. I picked up the motel phone and dialed a number I had memorized long ago. It rang 4 times before a voice answered. Rachel Cortez did not sound sleepy, even though it was past midnight. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, the brilliant legal mind who had designed the trust for us and managed our assets for 20 years. "Eleanor," she said. Her voice was calm but alert. "Why are you calling this late?" I took a deep breath and told her everything. I told her about the metallic taste in the Christmas dinner. I told her about Michael dying before he could warn me. I told her about the quitclaim deed Savannah had thrown on the table and the 30-day eviction notice. Rachel remained silent for a long time. I could hear the scratching of a pen on paper on her end. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was no longer just professional. It was dangerous. Go to sleep. Eleanor, she said, I will handle this in the morning. And Eleanor, listen to me closely. Do not eat anything you do not cook yourself. I hung up and lay back on the pillows. I stared at the ceiling and let my mind drift back to the house I had just left. I could almost see Savannah. She was probably lying in my son's bed, stretching out her limbs like a cat that had just eaten the canary. She likely had her phone in her hand, scrolling through contacts until she found a high-end real estate agent. I could imagine her voice, smooth and confident, bragging about a vintage property in Park Hill with a great view, mentioning that the previous owner had finally vacated. She thought she had won. She thought the game was over because she held a piece of paper with a forged signature. But the sun rises on the just and the unjust alike. The next morning, Savannah woke up early. She probably made coffee and waited for the real estate agent to arrive and praise her for her new asset. But the knock on the door at 9 a.m. was not a realtor in a luxury car. 2 police officers stood on the porch. They did not smile. In their hands, they held a thick file sent over by courier from the law offices of Rachel Cortez. It was not an offer to buy. It was a formal complaint for criminal trespassing, a notice of suspicion regarding a forged legal document, and a court order to preserve the crime scene relative to the suspicious death of Michael Graves. Savannah had tried to kick a helpless old woman out of her home. Instead, she had just invited the law into her own personal hell. I sat in a chair that likely cost more than my first car, looking out through a wall of glass on the 20th floor of a downtown Denver skyscraper. The cars down on the street looked like slow-moving beetles, crawling through the slush and grey snow. It was a different world up here, silent and hermetically sealed against the cold. I wrapped my hands around the porcelain cup of peppermint tea Rachel had placed in front of me, trying to stop them from shaking. Rachel Cortez sat across from me. She looked impeccable in a charcoal suit, a stark contrast to my worn wool coat and sensible shoes. She opened a thick file on her desk and looked at me with eyes that were sharp but kind. According to the records, 10 years ago, you transferred every piece of real estate you owned, including the Park Hill house, into the Graves Community Trust, Rachel said. She tapped the document with a manicured fingernail. Legally speaking, Eleanor, you do not own that house. You are the primary beneficiary. You have the right to live there for the rest of your life, and you receive the income from the rental properties. But the owner of record is the trust, and I am the administrator. She swiveled her monitor so I could see it. On the screen was a scanned image of the quitclaim deed Savannah had thrown at me the night before. Rachel explained that Savannah had actually emailed this to her office a week ago, under the guise of asking for a legal clarification on property taxes. It was a foolish mistake born of arrogance. We sent this scan to a handwriting expert immediately after you called me last night, Rachel said. The report came back an hour ago. It is a forgery. Eleanor. And a bad one. The pressure points on the ink show it was traced. But here is the part that proves Savannah is not just a criminal, but an incompetent one. Rachel leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave. Even if Michael had signed this, it would be worthless. Michael could not sign the house over to her because Michael did not own the house. You cannot give away what isn't yours. Savannah is trying to steal a deed that effectively does not exist. A cold shiver ran down my spine. If the document was worthless, then the entire confrontation, the threat of eviction, all of it was built on a lie that would have collapsed the moment a real lawyer looked at it. Then why, I asked. Why would she forge something so useless? Rachel looked at me, and for the first time, she looked unsettled. That is the question. Unless she thought that once you were gone, she could manipulate the trust documents. Or maybe she just needed a piece of paper to show a loan shark to buy time. She paused, then added another piece to the puzzle. Michael called me. Eleanor. He called me 3 days before Christmas. He sounded terrified. He asked me about some loan papers Savannah wanted him to sign, using the house as collateral. He asked if it was legal. I told him I needed to see the papers. We made an appointment for after the holidays. He never made it. I set my tea down because I could no longer hold it steady. The pieces were snapping together like a steel trap. Savannah had debts. She tried to get Michael to sign illegal loan papers. He refused or got suspicious and called Rachel. She realized he was going to expose her financial ruin. So she forged the deed to show her creditors. And then she cooked dinner. Rachel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. "We need to open a second front," she said. "The eviction threat is a distraction. I am going to file a petition to have Michael exhumed. I am going to request an independent autopsy. A healthy man of 43 who runs 5 miles a week does not just drop dead of a heart attack on the exact night his wife needs him out of the way to secure a loan." I looked at her back, taking a deep breath. I knew I had to tell her the rest, the part I had kept locked in my chest since Christmas Eve. "Rachel," I said. My voice sounded small in the large room. That night, the dinner. She turned around. "It wasn't his plate," I said. "Savannah served that portion to me. She made me a special plate. I switched them because I didn't trust the smell. Michael ate the food intended for me." Rachel stared at me. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. She walked back to the desk and sat down slowly, never taking her eyes off me. Her professional mask cracked, revealing pure horror underneath. "If you had not switched those plates," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper, "I would be sitting here right now having this conversation with Savannah. And she would be asking me how to liquidate the trust because her mother-in-law had died of a sudden heart attack." Rachel introduced me to Noah Briggs 2 days later. He was a man pushing 50, with a rumpled jacket that looked like it had spent the night on a floor and a 5 o'clock shadow that was 3 days old. He looked like a man who did not care about much. But when he looked at me, his eyes were sharp and clear, like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. He was a former police detective who now specialized in financial fraud and suspicious deaths. He sat opposite me, opening a fresh notebook, and asked me to start from the beginning. I told him everything. I told him about the metallic taste, the forced smile, and the way Savannah had insisted on filming. I told him about a moment I had almost forgotten, happening just an hour before dinner. I had walked past the guest bathroom and heard Savannah whispering urgently. When the door opened, she had jumped, her face pale. But then she winked at me a strange, twitchy wink and shoved her phone into her bra. I told Noah about the unknown number she had been staring at during the funeral. Noah wrote it all down, his pen scratching across the paper in short, aggressive bursts. He started with the money. It did not take him long to tear through the financial veil Savannah had draped over my son's life. Michael's accounts were clean. He paid his bills on time, had excellent credit, and saved religiously. Savannah, however, was a financial ghost. She had no credit cards in her own name because no bank would touch her. She had been living entirely off Michael. But that was not enough. Noah found the shadow accounts. Savannah had been using her maiden name and 3 different variations of her social security number to open accounts on offshore gambling sites. The numbers were staggering. She owed approximately $130,000 to $150,000 to various creditors, most of which were high-interest online lenders and betting platforms. Then came the physical surveillance. Noah pulled data from traffic cameras and cell phone tower pings. He found a pattern that made my stomach turn. Every 3 weeks. Savannah would drive her car up to a tribal casino in Wyoming. She would stay for 6 hours and drive back. On the return trips, she would often stop at pawn shops on the outskirts of Denver. We checked the records. She was selling jewelry, some of it mine, that had gone missing years ago, and high-end electronics. But the debts kept growing. The most terrifying discovery was the phone logs. Noah traced the number Savannah had been staring at during the funeral. It was a burner phone. But based on the location data and call patterns, Noah linked it to an associate of Mac Dunlan. Dunlan was a name even I recognized from the crime beat in the local papers. He was a loan shark with a history of assault and battery. He was not the kind of man you owed money to if you wanted to keep your kneecaps. He had been calling Savannah 5, sometimes 6 times a day in the week leading up to Christmas. But the final nail in the coffin was a video file Noah played for us on his laptop. It was security footage from a supermarket near my house, dated the day before Christmas Eve. Savannah was pushing a cart. She looked stressed, glancing over her shoulder. She put a turkey, herbs, and bread into the cart. Then, she walked to the pest control aisle. She picked up a box of cheap warfarin rat poison. At the checkout, she paid for the food with Michael's credit card. Then she asked the cashier to ring up the rat poison separately, and she paid for that with a crumpled $10 bill from her pocket. The silence in Rachel's office was heavy enough to crush bone. Noah reached into his bag and laid a series of photographs on the desk. One showed Savannah at a slot machine, eyes manic. Another showed her meeting a large man in a parking garage, Mac Dunlan's enforcer. The photo of the rat poison box was there, grainy but undeniable. And then Noah put down the last photo. It was a still frame taken from a gas station security camera on the morning of Christmas Eve. It showed Michael sitting in the driver's seat of his truck. He was not looking at the road. He was looking down at his hands, his head bowed, his face twisted in a mixture of heartbreak and exhaustion that I had never seen on him before. It was not the face of a man in a happy marriage. It was the face of a man who knew he was trapped. Savannah had posted a picture of them smiling on Instagram that same day. But this was the truth. My son was already mourning his life hours before she took it from him. Noah drove Rachel and me to a quiet office building in the Buckhead district of Denver to meet a woman named Maria Flores. She was a family law attorney in her 40s, the kind of woman who wore sensible suits and kept her secrets locked in fireproof cabinets. She was discreet, which was exactly why my son had chosen her. When Rachel explained the criminal investigation and the existence of the trust, Maria nodded slowly and placed a heavy file on her desk. She told us that Michael had come to see her 2 weeks before he died. She said his eyes were red from lack of sleep, but his mind was sharp. He told her everything. He told her that Savannah was not just a spender, but a liar. He had found the emails from the debt collectors. He had found the hidden accounts. He told Maria that he was terrified that if he did not act, Savannah would eventually find a way to bleed me dry to pay for her mistakes. He was not worried about his own credit score. He was worried about the Graves community trust. He was worried about me. Maria opened the file and slid 2 documents across the mahogany desk. One was a petition for divorce. The other was a new last will and testament. I looked down at the papers, and the room seemed to tilt. In this new will, Michael had left his entire estate to me, his savings, his small portfolio of stocks in Northwind Data Systems, and his pickup truck. Every single asset was designated to Eleanor Graves. Savannah's name did not appear once. He signed these 3 days before he died, Maria said softly. He insisted that I keep the originals here in the safe. He told me to keep them just in case something happened. Noah opened his laptop then. He had obtained the full video footage from the gas station security camera, the moving picture to match the still photograph he had shown us earlier. The timestamp showed it was less than 1 hour before the 911 call was made. On the screen, I saw my son's truck parked at the pump. Inside the cab, the argument was violent. I could not hear the words, but the body language screamed of a marriage that had already ended. I watched as Michael reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He threw them at Savannah. They hit her in the chest and scattered over the dashboard. I recognized the layout of the text. It was a copy of the divorce papers and the will. On the screen, Savannah's face contorted. It was a mask of pure panic, followed by a flash of rage. She began tearing the papers apart, her hands moving in a blur. Michael slammed his hands against the steering wheel. I could read his lips even through the grainy footage. He said, "It is over." The timeline was sickeningly clear. Michael had served her the papers in the car. He had told her she was getting nothing and that he was leaving. They had driven home in silence, and in that short window of time, less than 60 minutes, Savannah had gone into the kitchen, taken the box of rat poison she had bought with cash, and prepared the Christmas dinner she had insisted on cooking. She knew that if Michael filed those papers the next morning, she would be left with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and no home. But if he died that night, before the papers were filed, she would be the grieving widow entitled to his life insurance, and, she mistakenly thought, his house. I touched the signature on the will Maria had given me. It was firm and strong, nothing like the shaky forgery on the deed. My chest ached with a physical pain that was almost unbearable. My son had spent his final days trying to build a wall around me to keep me safe. He had tried to protect his mother from the predator sleeping in his bed. He had tried to save me. And because of that, she had killed him. Rachel placed her hand over mine. Her voice was steady, cutting through the fog of my grief. "Eleanor, look at me," she said. "Your son saw the truth about her, but he was 1 step too late. He did his part. Now it is your turn and mine to finish what he started." When the courier delivered the packages from Rachel's office to the Park Hill house, Savannah must have felt the ground open up beneath her feet. It was a trifecta of legal destruction. First came the forensic report confirming her forgery of the deed. Second was the formal complaint for criminal trespassing. And third, the most terrifying of all, was the notice that the county had approved the exhumation of Michael's body for a second autopsy. The control she thought she held was dissolving like sugar in hot water. In her panic, she did not call a lawyer. She reached for the only weapon she knew how to wield. She called the news. I sat on the edge of the stiff hotel bed, staring at the television as the 6 o'clock news began. The face of Trent Lawson filled the screen. He was a local reporter with perfect teeth and a reputation for turning complex tragedies into 30-second sound bites about good versus evil. He stood on the sidewalk in front of my house, the house my husband and I had built, looking grave. "Tonight," Lawson said in his practiced baritone. "A heartbreaking story of a young widow, grieving the sudden loss of her husband, only to be thrown onto the street by the very woman who should be comforting her." Then the camera cut to Savannah. She was sitting on the front porch swing. She had stripped away the glamour. There was no contouring on her cheeks, no red lipstick, no designer jewelry. She wore a baggy grey sweater that swallowed her frame and a pair of worn jeans. She held a tissue in her hand, twisting it nervously. It was a masterclass in manipulation. "He passed away less than a month ago," Savannah said to the camera, her voice cracking perfectly. "I thought we were family. But his mother, she never accepted me. She always thought I was not good enough for her son because I did not come from money. And now, she has this team of expensive lawyers, and they are telling me I have 30 days to get out. 30 days. Where am I supposed to go?" The screen flashed with headlines from social media. Young widow kicked out by millionaire mother-in-law. Community rallies for grieving wife. The comments scrolled by in a ticker at the bottom of the screen. They were vicious. Someone called me a monster. Another person said I deserved to die alone. My hands shook so violently that the remote rattled against the nightstand. Rage, hot and blinding, flooded my chest. I stood up, gasping for air. She was lying. Every word was a calculated inversion of the truth. She was the one who had tried to steal the house. She was the one who had driven my son to despair. She was the one who had put poison in a Christmas casserole intended for me. I grabbed my phone. "I have to call them," I told Rachel, who was sitting in the armchair by the window, watching the broadcast on her tablet. "I have to tell Trent Lawson the truth. I have to show him the papers. I have to scream that the person who was supposed to be dead is me, not him." Rachel stood up and took the phone from my hand. Her grip was firm. "No. Eleanor, you will do no such thing. But they hate me." I cried, pointing at the scrolling comments. "Look at what they are saying. Let them talk," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the noise of the television. "Listen to me. If you go on that show now, you look like a defensive, angry old woman fighting with a crying girl. You will lose. But right now, Savannah is terrified. She is talking because she is desperate. She is piling up lies on public record." Rachel pointed at the screen where Savannah was wiping a tear. "Every lie she tells on that camera is evidence. When the autopsy results come back, when the forgery is proven in court, when the divorce papers are revealed, this interview will not make people feel sorry for her. It will make them hate her. It will prove she was manipulating the public to cover a murder." I looked at Rachel, breathing hard. The logic was cold, but it was sound. "We stay silent," Rachel said. "We let her dig. The deeper she goes, the harder it will be for her to climb out when the dirt starts falling back in." I looked back at the TV. Savannah was looking directly into the lens, pleading for compassion, asking the community to help her fight the injustice of the wealthy elite. She looked so innocent. She looked so fragile. I walked over to the television set and pressed the power button. The screen went black, swallowing her image. I stood in the darkness of the hotel room, the silence settling around me like a shield. My anger did not vanish, but it changed. It cooled down into something solid and heavy, like a stone in my gut. "Fine," I whispered to the empty room. "You want the whole city to watch. Savannah. Then I will let the whole city watch you get handcuffed." The hardest thing I have ever had to do was not burying my son. It was signing the paper to dig him back up. Thanks to the substantial resources within the Graves Community Trust, Rachel was able to hire a team of independent forensic experts who convinced the county medical examiner that Michael's death warranted a second look. Standing in the cemetery on a grey, freezing morning, I watched the machinery tear into the half-frozen earth. When the casket was raised, heavy and mud-stained, I felt a wave of nausea so violent I nearly collapsed. It felt like I was killing him a second time, disturbing his peace for the sake of a fight he had already lost. But deep down, I knew there was no peace for him, not while his murderer was sleeping in his bed. The results came back 3 days later. We sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room at the coroner's office. The lead pathologist projected images onto the wall that made my stomach turn. But I forced myself to look. He explained that Michael's heart was perfect. There were no blockages, no defects, no signs of the cardiac arrest Savannah had screamed about. Instead, his blood and liver showed lethal concentrations of warfarin, and it was not a single dose. The analysis showed accumulation over several weeks. He had been slowly poisoned, day after day, until that final, fatal meal pushed him over the edge. The official cause of death was changed on the spot from natural causes to internal hemorrhage due to warfarin toxicity. The file was immediately stamped and couriered to the district attorney. While the criminal investigation was building steam in the shadows, Savannah was busy playing her hand in the light. She had filed a civil suit demanding immediate possession of the Park Hill house and the expulsion of the squatter, which was how she referred to me in the legal filing. The hearing was held in a crowded courtroom. Savannah had brought Trent Lawson, the reporter, and ensured he had a seat in the front row. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted the judge to see the grieving widow fighting for her rights against the cruel matriarch. Her lawyer gave a passionate opening statement, painting a picture of a young woman being bullied out of her inheritance. Savannah dabbed at dry eyes, looking periodically at the camera. When it was Rachel's turn, she did not appeal to emotion. She stood up, adjusted her glasses, and placed a single document on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice cool and detached. "The plaintiff is operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. Michael Graves could not have signed this house over to his wife because Michael Graves never owned this house. The property has been the sole asset of the Graves Community Trust for over a decade. He had no legal standing to transfer the deed. The document the plaintiff is holding is not only a forgery, which we will address later, but it is legally impossible." The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and zero tolerance for theatrics. She read the trust document, then looked at the forged deed Savannah's lawyer had submitted. She peered over her reading glasses at Savannah. The courtroom went silent. Case dismissed with prejudice due to lack of standing. The judge ruled, slamming her gavel. "And counsel, I am noting for the record that the signature on this deed appears highly irregular. I am forwarding this transcript to the fraud division." Savannah froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her lawyer looked frantically through his papers. Trent Lawson, who had his camera ready to capture the victory, lowered his lens, looking confused. Rachel seized the moment, As we exited the courtroom, reporters swarmed us, expecting a comment on the house dispute. Rachel held up a hand and used the 2 minutes of attention to change the narrative forever. "We are pleased the court recognized the truth," Rachel told the cameras. "But the house is the least of our concerns, given the evidence of $150,000 in gambling debts, a forged deed, a suppressed divorce petition, and the medical examiner's new finding of homicide by poisoning. We expect the focus to shift to Mrs. Graves's role as a suspect in her husband's murder." The word suspect hung in the air like smoke. Savannah, who was trying to slip out the side door, stopped dead. The colour drained from her face. She was cornered. As she tried to push past the media, a junior reporter thrust a microphone into her face. He didn't ask about her grief. He shouted a question that cut through the noise. "Ms. Graves, did you buy warfarin rat poison the day before Christmas?" Savannah turned to look at him, and for one split second, the camera caught it. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was the primal, wide-eyed terror of a trapped animal. That single frame would be on every screen in Denver by the 6 o'clock news. The tide had finally turned. The district attorney formally charged Savannah Graves with murder in the first degree, citing financial gain as the primary motive. The trial became a sensation overnight. The same local news trucks that had once camped on my lawn to film the grieving widow were now parked outside the courthouse to catch a glimpse of the woman they were calling the Black Widow of Park Hill. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the scent of cheap cologne and anticipation. I sat behind the prosecutor, my back straight, refusing to look at the woman in the orange jumpsuit sitting at the defense table. The prosecutor, a sharp man named Mr. Anderson, began by building a timeline that was as undeniable as it was damning. He did not start with the death. He started with the debt. He projected a graphic onto the screen showing Savannah's financial spiral. He showed the jury the $130,000 in gambling losses. He played the voicemails from the burner phone, the menacing voice of Mac Dunlan's enforcer demanding payment. He showed the rejected loan applications where Savannah had tried to mortgage a house she did not own. Then, he showed the date of the lawyer appointment Michael had made the appointment to sign the divorce papers and cut her out of his will. Then came the science. The forensic toxicologist took the stand and explained exactly how warfarin kills. He explained that it is a cumulative poison, thinning the blood until the body simply gives up. He testified that Michael's symptoms were classic signs of internal hemorrhage, not a heart attack. But the room went silent when he produced the results of the food analysis. On the night I left the house, I had scraped the remains of the casserole from my plate, the plate that was originally meant for Michael, into a plastic container and hidden it in my travel bag. I had kept it frozen until I gave it to Noah. The toxicologist confirmed that the casserole contained a lethal concentration of the exact same brand of rat poison found in Michael's system. Noah Briggs took the stand next. He was calm and methodical. He showed the jury the receipt for the rat poison, paid for in cash by a woman matching Savannah's description, just 24 hours before the dinner. He played a recorded call Noah had intercepted between Savannah and a number linked to the loan shark. In the audio, Savannah's voice was shrill and desperate. She begged for an extension until the end of December, promising that she would have a large sum from life insurance and the sale of a house. Rachel followed, laying out the legal trap Savannah had walked into. She held up the Graves Community Trust documents, the divorce petition, and the new will. She explained to the jury that Michael was worth nothing to Savannah alive and divorced, but dead and technically still married. He was her winning lottery ticket. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. I looked at Savannah, and for the first time, she looked down. I told the jury about that night. I described the heavy snow and the tension in the room. I described how Savannah had insisted on filming the dinner for her followers. I told them about the moment Michael smiled and put the food on my plate. He said, "Mom, taste this dish." I recounted, my voice steady. But when I looked down, I smelled metal. It smelled like copper and old pennies. I looked at Savannah, and she was holding her phone, waiting for me to eat. She was smiling, but her eyes were cold. I told them how I feigned a chill, how I stood up to move closer to the fire, how I switched the plates. I told them how I watched my son eat the food intended for me. I told them how Savannah's shoulders relaxed when he took that first bite. The defense attorney tried to rattle me. He called me a bitter, jealous old woman who was hallucinating from grief. He asked if I was senile. But every accusation he threw at me shattered against the wall of evidence we had built. The final blow came from an unexpected witness. Mac Dunlan, the loan shark, had cut a deal for immunity. He sat in the chair, looking like a shark in a cheap suit, and testified that Savannah had met him in a parking garage 3 days before Christmas. She told him specifically that her husband was sick and would not make it to the new year. She treated Michael's death as a guaranteed transaction. The closing argument was brief. Mr. Anderson stood before the jury and pointed a finger directly at Savannah. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the ventilation system. At Christmas dinner, her husband said, "Mom, taste this dish." She smiled because she knew exactly which plate was meant to kill. Only Eleanor Graves changed the script. The jury returned after 6 hours of deliberation. I sat next to Rachel, my hands cold as ice, but my eyes were wide open and dry. I refused to blink. At the defense table, Savannah slumped in her chair. The glamorous influencer who had once preened for cameras was gone. In her place was a pale woman in a shapeless grey dress, her roots showing, blending into the dull fabric of the furniture. When the foreman stood up, he did not look at her. "We find the defendant, Savannah Graves, guilty of murder in the first degree." He read. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The judge wasted no time. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He leaned over the bench, his voice filled with a quiet fury, and addressed her directly. He spoke of the cruelty of her crime, of the calculated malice required to slowly poison a spouse over weeks, and the depravity of using a family Christmas dinner as the final stage for murder. Savannah began to shake. The reality of the metal bars and the concrete walls was finally crashing down on her. As the bailiffs moved to cuff her wrists, she snapped. She lunged toward the gallery where I was sitting. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "If you had just eaten what he gave you, none of this would happen." She screamed. Her voice cracked, echoing off the mahogany walls. The entire courtroom gasped. It was not a plea for innocence. It was a confession of intent. She was not sorry she killed him. She was sorry she missed her target. I did not flinch. I did not shout back. I looked her dead in the eye as the officers pulled her back. Michael chose the right person to survive to tell this story, I said softly. Our eyes met for one last second. Hers were filled with desperate, impotent rage. Mine were filled with a bone-deep fatigue. But I was still standing. I watched as they dragged her through the side door. She was gone. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was a circus. Trent Lawson, the reporter who had once vilified me, pushed through the crowd. He looked sheepish. He asked if he could interview me again, promising to do a new segment that told the real truth about what happened. He wanted to paint me as a hero who outsmarted a killer. I stopped and looked at him. "You can tell the truth," I told him, "but do not paint me as a hero. I am not a hero. I am just a mother who is still alive." I walked away before he could ask another question. That evening, Rachel called to confirm that the civil case was closed. The Graves Community Trust was secure. The Park Hill house was safe, and I could live there for the rest of my days without fear. The assets Michael had tried to protect were returned to the estate. I returned to the empty house. The silence was different now. It was no longer threatening. It was just quiet. I walked into the kitchen and stood before the dining table where my son had eaten his last meal. I went to the cupboard and took down the dinner plate I had retrieved from the evidence box. I did not wash it. I placed it on the highest shelf of my china cabinet. A permanent reminder. Life and death are often separated by nothing more than a split-second decision and a swapped plate. I went out to the front porch and sat in my rocking chair. The snow was falling again, covering the scars of the winter. I did not think about charity foundations or grand plans for the future. I just watched the white flakes drift down in the streetlight. Justice did not bring my son back. He was still gone, and my heart was still broken. But justice had removed the monster from our table forever. For an old woman like me, that had to be enough. My revenge was not loud. It was not violent. My revenge was simply surviving when she wanted me dead. If that Christmas night was you, when your son said, "Mom, taste this dish," and your daughter-in-law smiled, what would you have done with the plate sitting in front of you? Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on what you would have done in my shoes. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and press the hype button to help this video reach more people.